Good afternoon, Beit Midrash. Welcome back. It's been a couple weeks. I missed you guys. I mean, I've seen some of you guys at like the last couple weeks, but you know what I mean. I've missed the class together. So, welcome back. Glad to have y'all here and glad to be learning together again. For some of you, welcome back. It's been a little bit. For some of you, welcome back. It's been a couple weeks. So glad to be learning with all y'all once again today. And for those who are not on the email list, I only like to watch on the recording after the class happens. You may or may not know we're starting a new session of Beit Midrash since we passed Simchat Torah. We finished our reading of Rabbi Sachs. We're starting a new book today, God of Becoming in Relationship by Rabbi Bradley Shavit Artson. And we're going to be learning that over at least the next few weeks until we're done, and then we'll figure it out after that. But so we're glad to be starting this new session with everybody today. So I did say this in the email, but for those who may have missed it in the email, I want to give a short introduction to this book before we discuss the introduction to this book. I first learned about this from Rabbi Artson, who was the dean of the dean of the rabbinical school where I went at the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies in Los Angeles. And he would kind of, if I remember correctly, he was kind of working on this while I was there. So, sometimes he would test drive some of the material with us. But there's a couple things, and some of it we'll talk about in the introduction. But one of the things I did not put in when we were doing the voting. I waited to reveal this until afterwards. Is Rabbi Artson was working on his PhD at that time, and this is essentially his PhD dissertation in philosophy. He talks about it briefly in the introduction. So it reads a little like a PhD dissertation in philosophy. So somebody before I started the recording said it's a little bit of a hard book. It is a little bit of a hard book because of what it was intended to be. And I have full faith in everybody on this class, everybody in this Zoom room, to help each other and work together to learn it together. So I do think it has a lot to teach. I do think it has a lot to help us understand and think about Judaism and theology in a different way, which is why I did not argue when somebody suggested it. So with that as kind of a brief introduction, did everybody get a chance to read the introduction to the book? Are there any thoughts, comments, reactions to kind of before we start to jump into it?
Well, I'll start. I loved it. I thought he was talking my language, kind of. I'm looking forward to hearing more about how he develops the idea and makes some corollaries between science and the way that the perspective that he has in looking, or the way that process theory, I guess. I never heard of process theory before, but it makes sense to me. It's kind of in line with what science says about that we are created, or we change every moment, that there is nothing static, and that's all an illusion. In fact, I've been writing about that.
Good. So we'll come back to that in a moment, and tackle that a little more too. Yes. Barbara Ayland.
So counterpoint, I was like the first couple pages, I was like rereading the same lines. It was really, really hard to get into. But I will say that, and I just read it. I mean, I finished it 10 minutes before this class. But by the time I got to the end, I was really excited about it's definitely going to be challenging for me. But I was excited about that, some of the ideas he brought up and how they may play out and how it may help me in my Jewish journey. So
Or Margaret, we'll go with you first.
Yeah, I must say I found it extremely intriguing, but I have already a gazillion questions of things where I just don't know what he is talking about. It kind of sounds kind of nice, but pinning it down is I think going to be a challenge.
So he wrote a good introduction, is what I hear. he laid a groundwork in which you're asking a lot of questions to get you to keep reading. So now you want to know how the answers to those questions.
That's one way to put it.
Barbara Brandy.
Are you ready for specific questions yet? Because I'd like to talk about two words. One is becoming. Does he mean, oh, Rabbi Henkin, your hairdo is very becoming? No, he doesn't. He means something else by becoming. And the other word that I'd like to ask you to speak about is faithfulness, because he refers to faithfulness and he does talk about, and I don't know which page, faithfulness. He does talk about being faithful as opposed to having a belief in God. So those two words were things I wanted to know more about.
Okay, so let's kind of dive in a little bit. Yes, Margaret?
I think those are great questions, Barbara, but I have a question that precedes those, if I may. And that is on the very first page, when he talks at the bottom of the page about getting over the sickly green overlay of Greek philosophy, taking Neoplatonic, Aristotelian, scholastic presuppositions and filtering religion through those ideas. Now, I think I know a little basic stuff about medieval thinking and Aristotle, but basically, I really don't. I don't know. He's arguing against something, and I'm not clear what he is arguing against.
Okay, so let's back up. I hear you. Let's back up for one moment. Let's pretend you hadn't picked up this book before, that you had not already read the introduction to this book. And I asked you to talk about God and what you believe God is or who God is. What would your answers be?
God is that guy in the Sistine Chapel roof that, has the long flowing hair.
Great. God is on the roof of the Sistine Chapel with the long flowing hair.
And outstretched hand.
Of course. Anybody else?
My answer would be, I'm not sure.
Okay. Fair response.
God is essentially unknowable.
Okay. Esther?
I kind of always had this view of God, and that I think is what is similar to what he's saying, of sort of the best of everybody. That something inside of you that is the ideal. And I don't necessarily even think of it as a supreme one being, but all the ancestors that went before me, kind of there as a resource pushing us to be the best that we can be.
Okay. Joshua?
I would say that I think God is like us, but unimaginably more so. So take everything we can understand about ourselves and make it more to the point where we don't understand it.
Okay. Laura? You're muted, but Laura, you're muted.
I sound more intelligent that way. I've
Because
always thought,
afterwards you can unmute and go, wow, wasn't that a brilliant thought? And
don't ask me to repeat it because I can't remember. I always thought of God as like the living spirit that's in everything that's alive. Like, God is in the trees and the plants and everything. So that's kind of my God belief, I guess. When I was really little, I thought of God as a human being like image, and that Jesus was his wife because of the long hair and robes. Real little.
Lisa, the last one, and then we'll.
Yeah, so for me, God, there always seems like there's something beyond the human experience, and something that somebody said unknowable, but something beyond the human experience that that there's something that makes sense of the world, some higher power that's unknowable and beyond our experience.
Okay. So, there's a lot of, knowingly or not, there's a lot of implications in the descriptions y'all were giving of this Neoplatonic Aristotelian deity. So, or theology, or influence of those. There's this Jewish theology generally oscillates between one of two poles. One pole is, to use the fancy philosophical term, transcendence, which is essentially what a lot of you were talking about. That God is beyond us, God is unknowable, God is like us, but so much more so that we can't quite fully comprehend it. That there's some kind of unreachable being that is separate from who we are. As my wife once quipped, it's the big dude in the sky theology, right? There's some big dude in the sky who is beyond us, more knowledgeable than us, greater than us, and we can't quite access it. The flip side of the theology is, again, to use the fancy term, an immanent theology. A theology of God as being super close to us and with us at all times and present in the world. That God is in all of our spirits and infiltrates the spirits of all living things. That's an immanent theology because God is always present in here and we can access it. So when we talk about God's omnipotence, that God is all powerful, that's a transcendent view in that God has a power that is well beyond anything we can imagine. But when we talk about God loving us, that is an immanent view. That is, God is close to us, cares for us. We can relate to that kind of God. everybody following so far? Because these are important steps to be able to walk through. So on some level, I think we have taken a highly rational, particularly with our knowledge of science, we take a highly rational, logical view of God, which means we follow a lot of Western philosophy with that, along the lines of Plato and Aristotle. Maimonides took a very Aristotelian view of this as well. And some of what you guys said follows Maimonides' theology to a T. That God is so unknowable, we can't actually say anything definitively about what or who God is, because that would be limiting God to our human knowledge. So we can't say that, we can't say God has a body, because that would limit God's reality. I can never say that word, or never say that word correctly, because that would limit that to what we imagine a body to be. We can only say what God is not, in Maimonides' view. We can only say that God God does not have a body like we have a body, or God does not. We can define a negative side. We can't define the positive, because that would limit what God is. So even saying God is loving limits God to some extent of what we imagine loving and being loved means. Kind of makes sense. Now, some of this, the classic Aristotelian example is that somewhere in concept, there is an idea of a perfect chair. There's kind of this ideal concept of a chair. But once you try to physically put that ideal into reality, it's necessarily imperfect by doing so. We can't quite reach the ideal, but we can try, which is why if you look at a whole bunch of different chairs, they all look different, because we're all trying to achieve this kind of ideal picture of a chair that we can't actually put into reality. Everybody following? Anybody not following? Please feel free to speak up, because I want to make sure you understand where Rabbi Artson is coming from. So, similarly, as some of you expressed, we think of God as in a similar way. That God is an ideal person. God is the ideal ideal characteristics within people. God is kind of this ideal that when it comes down to putting the world and humanity in that image, it's necessarily imperfect. But that also implies that there is some perfect concept out there that we are not, but that we're kind of looking up toward. Everybody still good so far? Now, what's the problem with an ideal concept?
It imposes limitations.
It imposes limitations, but it's already perfect. So it can't change. And when you start applying this kind of concept to God, you run into all sorts of philosophical problems. The biggest, most famous, most common one being that if God is the ideal and God has all the knowledge, God has all the power, God as the ideal is necessarily good, then why do bad things happen to good people? If God has the power to stop bad things from happening, why are they still happening? If God has the knowledge that bad things are going to happen, and has the power to stop it, and is good, why is that God allow that to happen? That is one of like a few problems. That's kind of just the most famous one. As Rabbi Artson would say, you can pick 2 out of 3. You can't have all 3 of them. Otherwise, you run into a problem. So, but nonetheless, we have been taught. I think what Rabbi Artson is arguing is we have been taught that that's the theology we should be holding, and it's rooted in Western Greek Roman philosophy generally. And what he's kind of trying to argue is we don't have to hold by that theology. Just because that's what we were taught doesn't mean that's the only option. And part of his argument is going to be that who says God has to be perfect and who says God has to be unchanging? We have an example in this week's Parsha. What's one of the first things that happens in this week's Parsha? Actually, it was at the end of last week's Parsha, I think, the beginning of chapter 6. God says, I regret making humanity. In and of itself, that's kind of, a difficult statement. But let's, if you have this ideal God, how did God not know what people were going to become? Why did God create them the way they were going to become? But even more importantly, if God created them and God is perfect, how can God regret anything? Regret involves a shift and a change. It involves a process of going from one state to another. If I have a big piece of chocolate cake, when I go into eating the chocolate cake, I'm like, this is a good idea. And then I eat it and I'm like, ooh, that was not such a good idea. I regret doing that. There's a shift, there's a change that happens there. So part of Rabbi Artson's argument is going to be God can change, and God, like us, is in the process of becoming and evolving and changing in relationship with us. That's part of what he's trying to say, is that we don't have to stick with the Western Aristotelian Neoplatonic ideal. There are alternative philosophies we can adapt. He locks into this process view because I think he views the Torah and rabbinic literature as actually implying something along this line. We've just interpreted it over the years along a different line than it was actually intended to be interpreted as. I think he thinks we've interpreted it along this Aristotelian Neoplatonic way, but that's not actually the way it was supposed to be read. That's, I think, the background and the where he's reading and coming from. Questions, thoughts so far?
It was, and it's fascinating to me to think about being very new to this whole idea of process theology, but like thinking about even the term process theology, and then thinking about reading, you know, traditional Jewish text, and you get the idea, and you even hear this phrase from some teachers where like uh observance is more important than belief, or ritual is more important than belief. And in a sense, that ritual is about, process and commitment. And so it seems like there's a very fundamental connection between the two ideas, with like the process of ritual and the process of observance of the mitzvot. It feels like there's already a pretty fundamental connection.
Yeah. This is kind of my view of the two, and I've spoken about it, here and there in the past. But I think process theology will fill into this as well. Is what's the point of the ritual and the observance? The point of the ritual and observance is to help remind you of God's presence in this world. That the that you are not alone, and that God is present in this world, and that at every moment the point of the ritual is to help remind you of that fact.
Which requires belief.
So the ritual reinforces the belief, and as you believe, you know that the ritual brings you closer to that being, so that you want to do the ritual, so that you can reinforce the belief, which reinforces the ritual. It becomes kind of a feedback loop.
Yeah, they feed one another. That's a good point.
TK?
Yeah, I have a question. So it's quite interesting that the early writers or writer of those words, that God regretted something. And I wonder, does that, you can look at that in two different ways. You can either look at it as, oh, wow, these writers of the early texts were thinking in a process way about God, or you can think or ask, or were they just closer to what we think was the ancient way of thinking about the divine, which was that they were reflections of human beings. They had, which is the Western Greek, Roman, the God and Mesopotamian idea that gods lived little lives just like humans, and they had the same kind of frailties as humans, and fought among each other, et cetera, et cetera.
Well,
and the idea that Judaism developed from that to focus on one God, and eventually this was the God.
So yes, I do think you're onto something there, but I think Rabbi Artson's going to latch on to what you're saying, is that yes, there is a element in which God is like us, that God can change God's mind, God can evolve, God can have emotions, God can feel things, but that to do that, you have to let go of some of the Greek overlay of that we are accustomed to. Because you're right, I don't think the ancient biblical writers, just making sure I didn't get struck by lightning, they did not view Hashem in the way that Maimonides did. They were living centuries before Plato and Aristotle. So, I mean, they didn't have that concept in the same way.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear part of what you just said.
I said, they did not, I think the ancient biblical writers did not have the same concept that Maimonides did, because they lived well before Plato and Aristotle to develop these ideas. So I do think there's a level at which Rabbi Artson's going to make the argument that we're reclaiming something that we've kind of forgotten about in that sense. Yes, Esther. You're muted. So.
I'm struck actually when you're talking about the ideal and this, I guess, this philosophical belief, the Plato, whatever. If we let go of the ideal and we talk about something more relational, first of all, the question is whose ideal? When you look at the ideal chair, what's the ideal chair for you is not necessarily the ideal chair for me. So what does that do to the whole concept of Judaism across the spectrum? That's one thought that I have. But also, what does that do to the concept of God? And if we're saying that, before all these philosophers, when these texts were written, and if we believe these texts were written by man, what does this really say about God, other than there's something that's unknown to us, which there are many things unknown to us? And how do you then put your faith into something that is unknown? Does that make any sense?
I think so. To answer the first part of your question about the ideal, I think, at least philosophically speaking, the concept is that there is a ideal, perfect concept of a chair that is perfect for everybody. It's a concept, though. You can't actually bring it into reality, because once you manifest it, it's no longer ideal.
Mm-hmm.
It's been concretized. So in that sense, we are, God is the ideal, and we are just, the concretized imitations in some sense.
So let's just stop there, because any person's concept, an Orthodox rabbi may have a different concept of what is ideal than what my concept of ideal is. And what about a Muslim ideal? Are we, there are many ideals that people have. Are we saying there's only one ideal?
So here's what I'll say two things. I'll say, one, I think if you were to go down Greek philosophy, yes, they'll say like there is this kind of perfect ideal, that this beautiful, perfect ideal that everything achieves. But I think what you're saying is poking a bit of a hole in that, is that, what does that mean? Like, how can there be everybody have the same ideal? That's not realistically true. I think that's a criticism of Aristotle and Plato. I don't think, I think that's part of where I think Rabbi Sachs would, I'm sorry, I'm so used to saying Rabbi Sachs. Rabbi Artson, I think Rabbi Artson would not necessarily disagree with you on that. Mm-hmm. But I think, I think one of the key lines in this introduction is at the bottom of page, what would be page for XIV 14. This kind of gives a glimpse into where he's going, is God is not outside the system as some unchanging eternal abstraction. Rather, God permeates every aspect of becoming, indeed grounds all becoming by inviting us in every level of reality to fulfill our optimal possibilities. God is not outside the system, which as an abstraction, God would necessarily have to be. God is, in fact, highly immanent. God is here. God is present in this world. God, in fact, permeates every aspect of becoming. God is constantly present and inviting us to make the choices that will help us be the best we can be. That has philosophical consequences, as we'll see as we go through the book. But that's kind of, I think, where he's trying to go, is that God is not outside the system. God is not outside of time. God is not outside of reality. God has not performed, as the Kabbalists say, a act of tzimtzum and kind of
Withdrawn.
thank you. I couldn't think. That wasn't the word I was thinking of. But that works. Like withdrawn from this world. God is present in every aspect of this world constantly, which just means part of our job is to tune into what God is trying to tell us at every moment. Get there. But that's kind of the general direction as you see there. He says in the same paragraph, Artson says in the same paragraph, God uses a persistent, persuasive power working in each of us, in all of creation, to nudge us toward the best possible outcome. But, and this is an important but in where he's going, God's power is not coercive and not all powerful. God cannot break the rules or unilaterally dictate our choices. Meaning?
Not all powerful.
Not all powerful. And
we have free will.
We get the choice. God can tell us what God wants us to do. God can't make us do it. Cindy?
So I have a problem with this notion of the best possible outcome. You know, in whose mind? I mean, for me, the best possible outcome of a situation may not be somebody else's best possible outcome of a situation. So while I don't have a problem with the idea of, God working through us or us working with God, I mean, just this best possible outcome thing is sort of upsetting to me.
So think of it kind of this way. I'll say two things. First, we'll cross that bridge at some point in the course of studying this book. But I think there's kind of this actually, let me rephrase it differently. You've been married for, let's say you've been married for 50 years. You know your spouse pretty well. And you might be able to know what's good for them because you know them so well. And therefore, you can help guide them onto what's good for them, sometimes even before they know what they're looking for. That's, I think, the idea that Rabbi Artson is going to, is that God knows us through relationship well enough to know what the best thing for us is in that moment and tries to guide us on that path. It's still our choice of whether we're going to do it, but it's the best possible outcome for us as an individual.
I think when you add the caveat of in this moment, that makes it a little bit easier to sit with because each moment is different. So maybe I was trying to go too far into the future.
Yeah.
If I'm working with in this moment, I can accept that better.
Yeah. Without giving spoilers too much, think of it this way: is at 12 o'clock today, you had a choice to make. You could sign on to this call and study with us, or you could have done something else. Heck, you could have said, you know what, I'm really tired. It's been a long week. I'm going to go take a nap. I'm just tired today. Okay, that's a choice. And, let's say, what's the best possible outcome? I don't know of that. But you made a choice to be here. So now, once you're here, you have a choice. You can actively participate in the conversation, or you can sit back and be passive. Once you make the choice to actively participate and be part of the conversation, you have another choice of, am I going to continue asking questions? And then after this class signs off, you're going to have another choice of, am I going to incorporate what I learned in this class into my life or not? Or your choice might be, what am I going to have for lunch? Am I going to have Chinese or am I going to have Mexican? These are all choices that we make, but each choice leads to the next choice. If you had gone to take a nap, the question of whether or not to participate in the conversation kind of goes away. So each moment there's a choice that guides us towards the next choice that we're going to make. And we have to, and God at each moment will guide us towards the best possible outcome for us at that moment. But that's going to then close off other starts, and then we're going to have to do the next choice that leads to the choice after that one. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so it's basically conscious, intentional living and not just not cruising through.
So I think it's going to be a step beyond that, but yes, like once we get into more of the theology, yes, there will be a level at which it's conscious, intentional living, but conscious of the relationship and obligations that are inherent in the relationship we have with God.
Thank you.
Barbara Ayland.
Oh, I don't know if Cindy meant this, but when she asked her question, I think that making it a moment in time does solve part of the problem. But the other piece to me was for everyone. Whereas what happens, how do you juggle what's best for you versus what's best for your spouse or even strangers? That's really difficult. And how much weight does each get and blah, blah, blah. So that's what I thought you were asking.
So
Cindy.
what I'll say is hold on to that question. I don't think we're deep enough in to be able to answer that. Quite honestly, I don't remember his answer to that question offhand. So, I'll relearn it with you too. And, we'll kind of go from there. But
it depends.
Possibly. I don't know. Barbara Brandy, did you have something?
No, it was Lisa that has her hands up.
Okay. Lisa.
Yeah, so I don't have any problem believing in the immanence of God and that God is permeating all of us in every aspect of our world. Where I have a little bit of a problem is trying to describe God using human constructs. And it seems like here is he using human constructs about change and creativity and dynamic? Are those human constructs that we're trying to lay on top of God, who maybe we can't describe in the terms that we know?
What I'll say, again, I'll kind of say a fair question, and maybe hold on to it to see if he addresses that question as we continue reading. We'll come back to it a little bit, as I do want to go through kind of some of the principles that he's going to address, that he addresses in the introduction. I don't think he entirely answers that question in there, but maybe it might help solve it a little bit. Margaret?
Well, maybe I should hold my question, because my question is, you are saying that God knows what we should do and nudges us in the direction of doing the thing that God knows is the best. And my question was, how do you listen to that? And how do you listen to that? But probably a later question.
A little bit. It's a later question. The short answer is you got to practice and you got to train yourself to listen, because it can be hard otherwise. There's a lot of noise out there in the world, so training yourself to listen to certain voices it takes some time and practice to learn to do. Yes. I want to take a quick moment to go over the kind of his overview of processed thought, because that's going to be kind of some of the groundwork he's going to build off of. So it's at the bottom of XV and onto the next page, XVI. So 15 and 16 if you don't like the Roman numerals. So some of the common assertions: the world and God are expressions of continuous dynamic relational change. The world is always changing, and God is always changing with it in relationship to as the world changes. So kind of going back to Cindy's question a little bit, once we make a decision and whatever the next decision is, God has to kind of adapt and change based on the decisions that we make. So that relationship is constantly and continuously changing and evolving. This is your fun in quantum mechanics, the second one, in quantum physics. We in the world are not solid substances, but rather recurrent patterns of energy, occasions that change with each new instantiation and also maintain continuity from moment to moment. Trying to figure out how to say that in clearer terms. But this is a big thing in quantum physics and quantum mechanics, is that we're not really solid, but that we're patterns of energy, which ties into the next one, is that we are interconnected patterns of energy, each to all. We are all kind of interconnected patterns of energy that we keep changing, but there is some continuity between it. So every interaction changes us, but there's still some sense of who we are beyond each interaction. Every occasion has a first-person mode as well as a third-person mode. This is the classic, there's three sides to every story: yours, mine, and the truth. When two people interact, they might come away with two different interpretations of what happened, which might, on a first-person level, be correct, but objectively might not be the same as what actually happened between them. Make sense? We in every occasion relate to each and all creation instantaneously and intuitively. We respond to the decisions of each other and of the totality. So we see ourselves are recreated in each instant. This is a little bit of the, I make we talked about, I make a choice that leads to the next choice. But sometimes the choice I make affects the choices you guys make. If I had made the choice not to show up to class today, it would have been a different choice than if one of you had not chosen to show up to class today. And my choice would have affected each and every one of you. And you would have then had to make a choice based on that. So it's not just our choices, but we also have to respond and react to each other's choices in each moment and each instant. If I say something radically rude, you each are going to have to choose how you're going to respond to what I say. God is the one who makes this relating possible, who creates the openness of a future of real novelty and the variety of its possibilities, and who relates to each of us in our particular individuality. This is very Martin Buber, in a sense, of the way that we relate to people and how we relate to people, and that God is present within the relationships that we have with each other and the world. And that God has offered us this possibility of relationship with each other, and is present in how we interact with each other. God is the one who invites us and empowers us in our particularity. I can't say that word apparently. Apparently philosophy doesn't come out of my mouth today. God knows us and relates to us as individuals. This is kind of what I was saying to Cindy before, that God knows us well enough to know what the right choices for us are and to guide us towards the right choice. And optimal means in maximizing experience, justice, compassion, and love. God tries to help us maximize those experiences and guide us towards those choices, but to exist to be self-determining. We still get to choose, and we are interconnected and creative to some degree. We can't choose something based on somebody else's reaction. We have to, and we can't choose for other people. We and everything in the cosmos become co-creators with God in fashioning the present. We make the choices, so whatever choices we make could create the reality of that moment. God's primary mode of power is persuasive, not coercive. That goes for us too. God can't make us do anything, but God can try to guide us and persuade us to make the right choices. And once that becomes actual, God knows what the reality is. This also implies to some extent, that God doesn't know what choice we're going to make. God lays the choices out. We have the choices. And once we make the choice, God knows what that reality and that choice is in that moment and guides us to the next choice. But God doesn't know what the choice will be ahead of time. Barbara Brandy, you look at
My question this time is, with the last one, does God cherish our bad choices?
I would say yes.
Well, according to this, you have to.
Well, yeah. I mean, I would say yes, because our bad choices are still part of who we are, and they offer us the opportunity to do tshuva from them. To learn and grow and become better people because of the bad choices we made.
And to me, we also exercised our ability to make a choice, which is the most like the ability of ours that connects us most to God.
Yes, our free will was given to us by God, so our bad choices, we still exercised the God-given right to make that bad choice. Um, Esther.
Okay, so we're talking about this in a very personal level, and in my head, I keep going global. And I am absolutely on board with this relational process thing. I mean, that's what life is. Life is a process, everything has impact. But on a global level, then, the question that comes to my mind, do we also then choose our own God? Because if this is the concept of God, then it's the Buddhist God, the Muslim God, the Christian God, whichever God we choose, which is also a choice, becomes the one that impacts our behavior. And how do we understand what we think are bad choices in other groups or religions or whatever? This is actually very disorienting to me, which surprised me. We want to have a concept of God. Someone's knocking at my door, but I can listen.
Yes. Yeah. On some level, I'll say it's good if you're feeling a little disoriented, because I think that's a little bit what Rabbi Artson's trying to do. I think he's trying to say, this is going to be different. This is not what you're used to. So it's probably good that you're a little disoriented, and that way you're uncomfortable and you can try to learn from your discomfort in that sense. Um, a little discomfort's a good thing. I think, in terms of defining what a quote unquote bad choice is, I think he kind of implies it a little bit here, that optimal is maximizing experience, justice, compassion, and love. So, what would be bad would be things that take you away from that, things that create distance rather than connection, that create injustice rather than justice, that create hate or apathy rather than love, things that create hurt rather than compassion. Those would be kind of the definition of bad choices. And that's kind of universal, of not dependent on who your God is. He's going to look. The way this book is going to be structured is the first half of the book. He's going to talk about process theology, kind of as itself. And so, as he says in the introduction, it was developed as a Protestant theology, but it's not limited necessarily to Protestant theology. So that the way he's reading it is it's kind of universal. And that in that sense, he'll say, Allah, Buddha, Vishnu will relate to you in the same ways, trying to maximize experience, compassion, love, connection, just using a different language to do so. The second half of the book, he'll say, okay, now this is how it kind of overlays into Jewish reality and Jewish life. Marged?
I've just been thinking about the quote, and I don't know where it comes from, where it says that God says, "I knew you in the womb."
That's first chapter of Jeremiah, I believe. But
yeah, and so I'm thinking about that in terms of your discussion about gods. I try not to put
so
any.
Where I think I would go with that, and how I would interpret that, would be God knows what your potential can be, even from the womb. That the kind of person you have the potential to be, you just still have to get there. I know it's getting late and people have to get back. We can do probably one more question and then we'll wrap up. Yes, Barbara.
Well, this is administrative. I was wondering if we're going to take his suggestion to start with the end of the book and read his letter to his son and then get back into the philosophy.
What I would suggest is, and I'll write this in the email for those who are not watching and signed off early. My suggestion would be kind of read that on your own. I don't know if you necessarily, I don't know how much we'll really need to discuss it, but it will help give you some of the, where he's coming from and kind of feed in with the introduction. I don't know if it might come up in conversation, but I would kind of read it on your own rather than, read it as we'll read his epilogue and discuss it together and then come back. If there are things that come up in the epilogue as you're reading it on your own, you're of course welcome to ask questions about it in class. Yes. Yes, Barbara Brandy.
My question is from what you mentioned about last week's Parsha. When God said he was disappointed in the behavior of man, didn't the angels tell him that was going to happen? And did they at that point say, I told you so?
There is a midrash in which, the angels kind of argue with God and God says, too bad. I can't think of a midrash where the angels go back and say, I told you so.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
I'm not saying it doesn't exist. I'm just saying I don't know it offhand. All right. Well, kol hakavod, everyone. Good to talk and learn together, and look forward to continuing to be uncomfortable and wrestle and become together, process and become together as we continue learning. So wishing everyone Shabbat Shalom, be well, and hope to see y'all on Shabbat. And if I don't, then wishing you a Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you, Rabbi.
And
Thank you, Rabbi.
don't forget, very important last note, Tuesday, you may have heard, is an election. Go vote. As Rabbi Artson says, it's a mitzvah doraita to vote. It's a mitzvah from the Torah to vote. So go exercise your civic and religious responsibility and go vote.
What are we reading for next week? Because
I'll send an email next week, but we'll read chapter 1 next week.
it's one page.
No, read that. That's an introduction to part 1.
Okay.
Read chapter 1 that comes after that also.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Take care,
Bye-bye.
everybody. Be well.
Thank you.